So Simple tutorial. Good morning students, welcome to SST So Simple tutorial. In the previous class we had discussed how the world was divided into Eastern and Western blocks on the basis of ideology of communism and capitalism. We had also read about NATO, Warsaw Pact, CETO and CENTO. Today we will discuss arenas of the Cold War. So let us begin. Let us first understand the name of the topic, arenas of the Cold War. When we say arenas of the Cold War, we mean the areas which faced crisis, where wars were fought, or there was a possibility of war between the two alliances. We have very recently read about Cuban Missile Crisis. So Cuba was one arena of Cold War. Similarly, during the Cold War, crises occurred in other parts of the world also. Sometimes situations went beyond threats and resulted in armed conflicts. But in none of the cases, conflicts led to another world war. In some of these arenas, like Korea and Berlin, the two superpowers came into direct confrontations. In some areas, like Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, many lives were also lost. But once again, none of them turned into a world war or a nuclear war. So, Korea, Berlin, Vietnam, Congo, Afghanistan, Cuba, all these were arenas of Cold War. In all these examples, my dear students, what you find is that both the rival blocs were helping the groups supporting their respective ideologies. And in all such wars, neither of the parties involved was willing to back down. In some cases, huge military buildups were reported. Sometimes diplomatic talks between the superpowers failed, and this contributed to misunderstandings. Fortunately, someone or the other mediated and tried to defuse the situation. For example, Jawaharlal Nehru, one of the most important leaders of non-aligned movement, played a crucial role in mediating between the two Koreas. We will discuss non-aligned movement sometime later. Similarly, in the Congo crisis, the UN Secretary General played a key mediatory role. But by and large, the superpowers realized that there was no winner in case of a nuclear war. So they felt that war must be avoided by all means. And it was this realization that made them exercise restraint and behave more responsibly. But at the same time, the two sides also understood that war might occur in spite of restraints. And if that happens, their capacity should not be proved less than the capacity of the other. There was always a feeling of suspicion and mutual distrust between them. And as a result of this suspicion that the other might become more powerful, both these powers began to arm themselves. Both of them thought that increasing their stocks of weapons will threaten the other. Hence, stockpiling of arms was considered necessary to deter the other. This way, they also intended to demonstrate the other bloc that they were better prepared and had better capacity to damage the other. So, they put more emphasis on their military preparedness. But what happens, dear students? Military preparedness of one automatically leads to military buildup of the other. Thus, it led to unending arms race between them. Both of them spent large sums of money on arms and amassed deadly weapons. But at the same time, there were other concerns as well, like what if a nuclear accident takes place? Like what would happen if someone fired off a nuclear weapon by mistake? Or if a soldier mischievously shot off a weapon deliberately to start a war? One cannot rule out these possibilities. Then how would the leaders of that country know that it was an accident and not an act of sabotage by the enemy? See, these are genuine concerns. So both the superpowers thought it prudent to move into the direction of disarmament and arms control. They collaborated in limiting certain kinds of nuclear and non-nuclear weapons. Working in this direction, the two sides signed three significant agreements. They were the Limited Test Ban Treaty, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Let us know about them. The first such treaty is LTBT, that is Limited Test Ban Treaty. This treaty banned nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, in the outer space, and underwater. This treaty was signed by the US, the UK, and USSR in Moscow. It entered into force on 10th of October 1963. The second treaty is NPT, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. What is the meaning of nuclear proliferation? Nuclear proliferation means the spread of nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons technology or fissile material to countries that do not possess them. This treaty is Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That means its objective is opposite. It was signed in 1968. What does this treaty say? This treaty allows only the nuclear weapon state to have nuclear weapon and stops others from acquiring this. So, who will be called a nuclear weapon state now? For the purposes of the NPT, a nuclear weapon state is one which manufactured and exploded a nuclear weapon or other nuclear explosive device prior to January 1967. So, according to this treaty, there are only 5 nuclear weapon states, that is US, the USSR, Britain, France, and China. It is for this reason India and few others are not acknowledged as nuclear weapon state. India, dear students, has not signed this treaty, citing it discriminatory. The next is SALT 1, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks 1. The first round of strategic arms limitation talks began in November 1969. The Soviet leader Brezhnev and US President Nixon signed the following in Moscow on 26 May 1972. First, Treaty on Limitations of Anti-Ballistic Missile System ABM and Interim Agreement on the Limitation of Strategic Offensive Arms. It entered into force on 3rd of October 1972. The next is SALT 2. Negotiations for the SALT 2 started in November 1972. The US President Jimmy Carter and Soviet leader Brezhnev signed this treaty on the limitation of strategic offensive arms in Vienna on 18th June 1979. You can see them signing the treaty. The next is START Treaty. The START Treaty seemed to end the Cold War between the two superpowers. START 1, Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty 1. This treaty was a bilateral arms control between the US and the Soviet Union. It was signed in July 1991. At Moscow summit, Gorbachev and George Bush the Senior signed a pact to reduce long-range nuclear weapons by 30%. START 2, that means Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty 2. This was similar to START 1. It was signed in January 1993 between the presidents of Russia and the USA. This treaty stipulated that nuclear stockpiles would be reduced to 2/3 within 10 years, that means by January 2003. In January 1994, the United States and Russia agreed not to target their missiles at each other. Thereafter, the superpowers held several rounds of arms limitation talks and signed several more treaties to limit their arms. So this is in brief arms control treaties. Let me stop here, students. In the next class, we will discuss the timeline of the Cold War, which will give you a clear picture of the entire Cold War episode. We will discuss in short what all happened in Korea, in Berlin, and in other arenas of Cold War. Till then, keep reading, and have a nice time. Thank you.